Hello, everybody out there. Thanks for having me. The slides are out there, and feel free to reach out to me with any kind of questions. But let's kind of get into this and get into the fun stuff. So to give you a little bit of context, I want to give you an idea of where this talk even came from. A few years back, I was helping out an organization going through one of those transformation things. They were doing lots of the right things, but some agile person came in and said there is no architecture with agile teams, which is a pretty irresponsible thing to say. And of course, this freaked out a lot of architects. They said, "What do you mean? What do we do if there's no architecture? There has to be architecture, in all these other types of situations." And not only was I thinking about that was kind of a irresponsible thing to say. I used to be an architect for Red Hat for a few years, and I remember even when I was doing those things, like I never went to an organization and somebody said our architecture is perfect. They would always be talking about the problems of the architecture or the things they didn't know or the premature optimizations people were making. And so I started thinking about the problem a little bit, and it wasn't so much somebody was irresponsible, or it wasn't so much that there has to be architecture. It just felt like people were drastically missing like a balance of architecture. And so that's why I started thinking about this problem space and how we could do better. So my goal with our time together and hopefully the discussions we continue to have is just to give you some really simple, pragmatic ideas, things you can try with your teams that I've seen work really well. So let's talk about architecture a little bit. This is my foundational statement. Behind every architectural decision, there is an assumption about your product, and I think that's maybe a bold statement. But think about the products and the things that you're building. The products are just basic assumptions. We think somebody wants to do this. We think they want to do it a certain way, and if the products are just guesses, then how can we make the architecture be anything more than a guess? Right? If we're just kind of guessing and hoping that people will want to use a thing, and we hope we understand the problem well enough to make people's lives a little better, then obviously we're just making decisions based upon assumptions, and that's just. I think we have to accept that. I think we have to accept that we're making decisions based upon assumptions, and we have to embrace that uncertainty. But we can't let that uncertainty kind of lock us up and make us want to do more analysis or be more correct. We have to understand that there's this swinging spectrum of things along the way. We have to build something to learn if we're doing the right thing, but it also can't be so fragile that it just falls apart. So we have to find this understanding of the product. We have to understand the assumptions of our product and help that guide our decisions around architecture. So again, the outcomes I want you to get out of this together. I'm going to show you some visuals. The biggest thing to really think about is if the conversation you're having with your team starts to shift a little bit from what architecture should we use or what's the design towards more of the discussion around when is this decision important, I think that becomes an interesting conversation you can have with your teams. And I think you can get there using some of these visuals we'll use. We'll talk a lot along the way about using products to help us ground these decisions. And then last but not least, we'll do some real quick things around documenting because everybody loves documenting things. So let's start with this basic definition of the problem. Architecture is not just boxes and arrows, right? That would be an oversimplistic view of the world. Architecture isn't just we have a front end and then there's some REST API and it connects to a database and everybody's happy. Architecture is fundamentally decisions that have trade-offs. This is a snapshot from a wonderful book, Notes on the Synthesis of Form from Christopher Alexander. This is a physical architecture book. Christopher Alexander, for those that don't know, is one of the people behind a lot of the object-oriented programs and designs, but his background was physical architecture. And this book, I think, was actually a textbook from Harvard, if that's where he taught. I forget, someplace out by you all. But the point being is, in his discussion around architecture, he was saying when you're building physical things, every decision point is a trade-off. And so in this example here, he's showing you that there's in building a physical building, there's a trade-off between simplicity and the economics of it and the performance of it. And in this example, it was jointing, and so how things were connected. By increasing the amount you would pay for it, you might be able to make something simpler, right? So there's a direct correlation between the increase and decrease across these things. And when I apply this and I think about the things that we build, this is exactly the kind of problems we sit in. We want to do things like microservices, and so that increases our ability to do independent deployable items, maybe move faster, but at the cost of a distributed problem. Right now we have a more complicated debugging scenario where we have to get into more observability and have deeper kinds of metrics and monitoring. So we have this trade-off between like the simplicity of the monitoring and the ease of the deployments and the iterating of the product, right? So the point is that these architectural decisions are never separate. It's not just, oh, we need a database, right? Everything has a trade-off. If we extrapolate this out a little bit, this is, again, of course, from Christopher's book, but you can see this is kind of what happens, right? Like the top picture here is meant to be given a sample problem with all of these kind of interdependencies around architectural decision points and how they're all correlated and tied and they have impacts to each other. The middle picture is this idea of an optimal decomposition. Look, problems are hard, right? We're not going to find the one answer to rule them all, but what we can do is find the best possible decomposition of the problem, the best possible way of grouping things together so we can simplify the problem as much as we can. I think we do that through this idea of product thinking, which I'm going to get to in a second. But the challenge that we face a lot of times is this bottom area, where instead of actually having a context or looking at a way of doing an optimal decomposition or a grouping, we get to this idea of a bias simplification. We take what we've known from the past or the things we want to do, and we ignore some of the other trade-offs, and we create this simplified view of the problems that doesn't really address all of the trade-offs. We do things like, I've always wanted to learn how to do SMS on Amazon, so I would really want to make sure we do a messaging solution here. We should really do messaging, where messaging might not be the right fit because of the problem space. To give you an example of this, I had a team I was working with last week doing some really crazy things with geolocations and all this fun stuff. And the engineers and the architects got to a point where they realized that they were getting data that was 1/100th of a degree latitude different. And so they spent all this time wanting to redesign it because they, what happens if we're off by 100th of a degree? I don't know if anybody knows, but like 100th of a degree is a pretty small distance in the world. And if they would have thought about how people were using it, they wouldn't have spent a lot of time worrying about 100th of a degree. They would have realized that the problem space, that margin of error was totally acceptable, but they were devoid of context, and so they went deep into this solution and redesigning space. So what can you do about this? How can we make the groupings better? Obviously, my bias is towards using product to ground decisions. I don't mean your product owner tells you how to do design, right? That probably wouldn't be a good thing. But I think we need to have context around the things that we're building to help us make better decisions. The easiest and simplest way I do this with a lot of teams is doing this idea of visual storyboarding, story mapping of the things that they could build. And this example up here, if you can see it, the idea is meant to be like a travel system, right? And so up here you can see if you're building an online travel system for people to book flights in a pre-COVID kind of world, there would be all of these things that you could possibly do. Various algorithms you could implement, various ways of doing notifications, various ways of doing databases, various ways of scaling, various points of resiliency, and there would be all of these things you'd have to consider. But you probably shouldn't, and a lot of it depends upon what your product actually needs to do and where you are. And so if we were to kind of lay this out and say, here's the world of possibilities, but what's important for us? If we were to look at 3 different scenarios, you might see 3 different architectures. If we were to say, well, the only thing we're worrying about right now is a group of family traveling together. Okay, well, what's the context of a group of family traveling They tend to do things like poke around and save and do a lot of research, and they want to save trips and they want to do a lot of comparisons, but they're really not doing this kind of ad hoc type of purchasing. They do a lot of research, and so the idea might be that they might need more normalized stateful data, but they don't really need kind of push notifications, instant messaging. They don't need a bunch of these things to happen. They need kind of solid state, stable type of environments. If we were to look at that and compare that differently to like a business traveler isn't doing a lot of poking around. They're just buying things as they need them. They might care about notifications in real time that flights are delayed, or they could get an earlier flight. And so in the previous example, we might want more of a stateful database type of thing, but in this business traveler thing, we might want more of a messaging approach. We might want more integrations and less stateful information because the need of the product is different, and therefore the architecture needs to adapt to that product or to that use case. But if we just kind of looked at the product as booking travel, we'd have an overly complicated system, because we wouldn't be looking at we wouldn't be using a vector to say, how do we make a better decomposition of the problem? If I took it another step further, there might be this person that travels on a whim, and so they have more notifications, more randomness. They're more cared about where they are right now, because they're always in different places. Kind of this adventurer travel. And so again, it's a different type of a decision point. Maybe this one has to have more of the geolocation things in, and it has to have more information around where the person is, versus kind of more of a stateful person. But again, the context of the use changes the architecture so drastically. Like if I would have just said to you right off the bat, build a travel system, you would say, okay, I need a front end. I'm going to have some integration services. I probably want a database. But as soon as you take this vector that says kind of like who's it being used by and what's the intent, you can see that the decisions become different. So you have all these different ways of possibly doing it. And then you have this better route where if you want to do microservices and you want to get into some of the chaos space and design, and you want to do some domain-driven design, you can start looking at these things and saying, here's the world of our possibilities. What might some of the domains look like? If they become unavailable, what happens? And you can do all these things in a very simple way that would help you validate some of your domains, as well as even get you thinking a little bit about the resiliency of your domains. What happens when this aspect goes down? So again, this is all cheap and easy and free, and it's way cheaper than writing code. Just by talking through and using context to say kind of, what's the purpose? How am I using it? What happens when? So this is, storyboarding and visualization is just a nice way to get things started and going. Just to prove to you that it is actually done, this is an example from a group we were working with a long time ago. They were doing like this network 4.0 stuff. But long story short, with this group, they couldn't figure out how to start. They had too many decision points around how many different things the network could do. And instead of worrying about all the things it could do, we talked about what's the first thing it needs to do. And it helped them really drive into this idea of focus, and it created a different optimal grouping for them to make their decisions based upon. A couple other things for you to consider. This idea of knowing where you are. So this is something that if you haven't heard or read about from Kent Beck, I highly recommend checking out. Kent Beck, the creator of Extreme Programming, just an overall brilliant gentleman. He was talking about this for the last few years, this idea of explore, expand, extract. If I were to kind of distill it down for you, and by all means, Kent, his presentations and writings are much better than me on this. Kent would say you have this kind of three different areas of a product, right? You have this idea where initially a product is unknown, and so you're trying to explore ideas and figure out if you should invest in it and you shouldn't build in it. Once you find a good market fit and something that you want to then grow, you enter a different phase, and you have this idea of expanding. Now we have found this idea, we want to make it as ready for as many people as possible, so we want to kind of grow it out. And then you get to a point where the product's kind of stabilized and you're trying to extract as much value out of it as possible. If you had this discussion with your group, your team, and you're saying, we're building something, we're building this product, the architectural view that you'd want to take would drastically differ depending upon where you are in this curve. If you are in a pure exploration standpoint, you need speed, you need to learn fast. And so you might not be worried about the size and the complexity, but you have a very small space and you're trying to learn as fast as possible. So you don't want the architecture to get in the way, but you want it to be good enough. Once you get to this expand spot, the architecture has to be stable, right? It has to be good, it has to be known, it has to be resilient. And so if you're in the explore space, you might be spending more time changing and doing quick prototypes in architecture, but in the expand space, you have to be consistent in your approach. Once you get to the extract space, you're going to be looking at things around how do I remove complexities, how do I remove unnecessary aspects? Is there a way I can move from one database to a different database to save money, because now the product's stable and the use case is stable, but now the architecture needs to be simplified or the cost needs to be reduced. If we try blending cost reduction with hyper scaling around a problem we don't know about, if we try collapsing all three of these at the same time, that's just not a recipe for a good time, right? You're gonna do things in a bad way because you're mixing too many metaphors and too many needs simultaneously. You're taking the least optimal decomposition of your problem and you're mudging them all together. So have this conversation with your group. Where are we at in this curve? What's the responsible architecture given where we're at in this part of the curve, and address it in that way. And then think about this: explore what you actually want to move. I've done this little kind of group here a few different ways. It's a simple right quadrant, right? Y-axis being how well you know the problem space versus how uncertain it is, and then left to right, how dependent your product is upon this idea of it being successful. And so you might take some of these decision points and plot them along inside here, and you'd get something like this. And so this was from a market data product I worked on, probably about 10 years ago. And so what I'm reflecting inside here is the size of these bubbles is the cost of being wrong. I was working on a trading platform, and so if we were wrong about our matching algorithms, it was very costly to change it, hence the big bubble, right, to the right and the dependent. But we knew how to write matching algorithms, so it wasn't an unknown space. Further down, and even kind of diagonally, there was this idea of data segregation. How should we actually chunk the data out that we are disseminating? We didn't know because we couldn't know. We wouldn't know how the data would be used. So to architect around a certain data pattern would be premature, and we wouldn't know how to do these things. But it was very costly to be wrong. So we had to think about, okay, we need to experiment more around the data segregation side to find a better architecture and find a better pattern around the data segregation. So again, using this kind of visual is just a nice way for teams to communicate around, these are our decision points. This is the relative cost of being wrong. And then have these questions around, are there things we can do to move from more dependent to less dependent? Are there tests or experiments we need to do to go from uncertain to more certain, to more known? So again, just a nice conversation starter, getting teams aligned around ideas and purpose. The obligatory picture, right, just to show you it actually does happen, right? So here's somebody walking through some diagrams with some sketches that are there talking about how people are using the product here. But again, it influences the design of the architecture, what's relevant when. Last few slides just for you to consider, then I promise you we'll get to the Q&A here. Understanding the assumptions of your architecture. Look, we're all wrong. Chances are, no matter how right we are about designs or about implementations or architecture, we're going to be wrong. Just kind of accept it. So my thing is, know that you're going to be wrong. Know that you're making assumptions about this. And so if I wanted to document things, I don't know if I would document so much how the architecture worked so much as I would document, here's the assumptions we're making about the architecture. Here's the assumptions we're making about the product. Here's how they correlate. And then you can revisit these things after you learn how the product's being used to see if your architectural decisions are still relevant based upon what you've learned about the product. If you do this, think about a couple ways you might be wrong. That would be nice things to test. And then for those things that you learn, what would you change about the architecture? If you learned that it turned out that people really didn't care about, nobody was reacting to notifications, what would you change in the architecture to simplify the problem space? So again, kind of continuously learning for the optimal grouping of your trade-offs. So there you go. In closing, we have this world of possibilities. You're all builders and creators. You can create anything. I think our goal is to apply proper context and proper understanding and proper constraints so that we build systems that are contextually and time appropriate, that are still maneuverable, right? We can still adjust based upon the things that we need to adjust to that bring joy and happiness to the people that want to use our products. Use these product things, use these conversations, use these decision points as means of building better things for people. So yeah, be aware of your dependencies and your models. Understand that there are trade-offs. Use the product context to figure out when decisions could be made. Are these decisions relevant now? A couple good books for you to read. I promise you the slides will be up. They're already up, actually, to check out for any kind of reading you want to do. That's a book I wrote, so don't sweat that. And then questions. What all do you have?
All right. Great, Joel. Thank you so much. Definitely good material, definitely things that we should all be thinking about. For questions, again, feel free to put them in the chat in the main stage, and I will ask them live. In the meanwhile, let's just get started with who should we be involving in architecture discussions? Is it just the architects? Should we be bringing explicitly the product people in? How should we try and optimize for that?
So it's a good question. I think you obviously need the product people involved because I've seen too many architects not know enough about the product to really kind of speak to it. Sometimes I think about like this kind of like Venn diagram where you have I don't really call them people so much as perspectives. There's somebody that has a perspective around like the financial cost of things. This is how much this idea is worth. This is how much I want to spend on it. This is kind of the return on investment I'm expecting. There's people that have this perspective around how people want to use it and the problems they're trying to solve. And then there's this perspective around that people have around the feasibility around how we could build it and what the trade-offs are along there. I think you need that kind of community together to walk through these things because we could build things that are wildly inexpensive, and that's not good. We could design things that nobody wants, and that's not good. So we need these perspectives involved. I think you need that financial, you need that customer, and you need that design feel to it as a group.
Cool. I'm thinking of the story for a lot of startups where they sometimes don't necessarily know ahead of time what the product is just yet. You might rev the product itself a couple of times before you're really committed to, well, our product does this. So is it possible to start thinking about architecture if you've sort of already kicked off your product, but you don't know that you've entered the final state of your product?
I think if you're in that standpoint, you'd have to hone in on what you think the critical aspect of your architecture is and not go beyond that. I had this one group, this is probably 7 or 8 years ago, they were building a Ruby on Rails app, and they were really concerned about scaling it, right? They said, we have to be able to handle 10,000 concurrent users. It's like, oh, that's great, let's talk about it. And I go, well, how many users do you have right now? And they said, we have about 15. I go, I don't think that's your problem right now, right? So, your problem right now isn't how do you scale. Your problem is how do you find people that want to get to that need. But for the product side of things, if you're at a startup and your niche, your differentiator is going to be upon speed or relevance of information or like the essence of the problem you're trying to solve, you got to understand that architectural constraint. It'd be silly for you to ignore it. But if you're trying to find out everything around everything else around it that you could do, that's too much, too fast.
Right. So on the flip side of that, if I work for a company that already has a really strong culture of product planning, are there any bite-sized steps that I can start to take to start iterating architecture? If
you have a strong product planning group, the simplest thing that I've done for all groups is the story mapping and talking about laying over architectural decisions across a story map. Because story map is going to be a thread of your experience, and then we can start pointing to things. I find the visualization and the ability for people to point to things, it's as silly as it sounds, it just creates new conversations. Somebody can say, this person's going through this experience, and right here they're doing this, and somebody says, well, the problem with that is, we're hitting 4 databases right now, and so we have to kind of figure out a way of assimilating data and correlating data so that experience isn't bad. Now we've immediately bridged that conversation. But if people just kind of put things in a backlog, they lose the context. And so I think story mapping and talking about how the story map relates to the architecture is the first easiest step for people to do.
Got it. Are there any ideas that we can borrow from other methodologies, other fields like lean manufacturing that can help us do the blending of product and architecture? Like with chaos engineering, we have these ideas of shorter feedback cycles. Are there any corollaries in other fields that might help us here?
Man, I think there's a ton of corollaries. I think it would be interesting for people. So lean manufacturing, they'll talk a lot about value demand versus failure demand. I don't think we ever consider tying value demand and failure demand into the architectural decisions we have. Like nobody, at least I should say the people I know, I haven't seen any groups ever come back and say, what are the parts of our product that are actually not working, and how does that impact the architecture? So like what are like the high cost, low value areas that we should just kind of get rid of? Instead of people doing that, they tend to think if we add more functionality to it, then it'll be good, which compounds the problem. I wish people would think more about this idea of value demand and failure demand and how it impacts products and architecture.
Right. I've got a question from the audience. Joel, have you ever effectively used a lean canvas?
Effectively used a lean canvas. There are so many canvases out there. If I said yes, I'm sure it'd be some kind of bastardized version of a lean canvas I've done. I've done product canvases, lean canvases, opportunity canvas, empathy canvases. I've used them all to various levels of success. I'm guessing there's another question there to it. What's the second part of the question?
That is all I've got up at the moment so far. Pablo/Paul, do you have a follow-up to that? He may not. Yeah, anybody else also feel free, if you have questions, don't put them into the stage chat and I'll ask them live right now. Okay, Paul says we need to build a list of canvases.
Yeah. I knew somebody like 2 years ago that started doing it, and it was kind of silly. If I had to guess, Pablo or Paul, was the idea behind a lean canvas would be just really to kind of help the group hone in on the essence of their problem, right? I mean, that's the intent there. And if we were able to do that, then it would drive the conversation much better around the architecture and the product. I think that's spot on. If I'm working with teams and architects that are trying to build things, I want to figure out the essence of the problem in the smallest pieces possible, because problems are hard. I mean, like we build crazy complex systems. I don't want to make them any harder than they need to be. A good friend and somebody that I've learned a ton from, Woody Zuhl, I've worked with him, and he said things like, "This is hard. How do we make the problem half as hard as it is?" And just kind of continuously apply that. And so the idea behind a lean canvas is just that. How do we half the problem?
Here's me testing screen sharing.
I think we have some bleed on the audio. But strangely enough, that is the same person who is asking you all these questions in the audience. So yeah, does anybody have other questions for Joel? Give it one more minute. We have a comment from Peter Bishop. I like the idea of using graphics to describe the form, to see the whole thing, and then diving into code.
It's way cheaper. I can tell you that. Way cheaper.
All right. Well, I think we've had a pretty good conversation. So Joel, thank you so much for joining us.